And they have an incredibly strong urban agglomeration, right? You need lots of talented people, and you need them in fairly close proximity. And so you could go back to the classic work of Alfred Marshall, concentration because you get pools of labour, you get pools of information, you get shared services. And, during the kind of suburban things, those were weakened, but with the rise of this type of economy, actually it reinforces the urban thing. And I think that's what happened to places like Hong Kong, right? You never ever lost that sort of creative cultural economy's always been kind of going on so that's retained this as well as other things. But I think that's one of the reasons. So you can see this resurgence, I think, is partly more jobs, higher paid jobs, changing the sort of narrative of what's cool. So when they do, where did graduates of Harvard and Yale go to in the 1950s compared to the 1990s? Well, they're all going in the 1990s, they're following the money, right? And the money is in places like New York. Whereas before, the 50s and 60s, it was that W.H. White organization man thing. They were joining big corporations like IBM, which had a place in Endicott, New York, which is a small kind of town. So they were quite literally, if you mapped on where they were going to corporate headquarters in Cleveland, Cincinnati, suburban areas. When you map them where they're going in the 1990s, it's like Friends, right? They're all going into New York or Chicago. And so what that's led to in the US is a kind of revalorization. So all this stuff that's happening, singles moving into the cities, a much more dynamic central urban economy. You're getting a kind of revalorization of urban spaces because the older cities in particular had all this almost kind of excess space, or space that worked for the industrial era or became kind of post-industrial. And so in many kind of big cities, I no experience of this in Hong Kong, I'm sure, but there's lots of vacant space in big cities, especially big American cities. The suburban thing had dragged things out, and so it dragged the demand out, and so there was no dynamic to kind of reclaim all this empty space, which obviously is not the same case in Hong Kong, right? Okay, so, and that's okay.
Well, industrial buildings.
Sure, okay.
Buildings, but it's...
Okay, but so even in Hong Kong, but you could imagine even more so in the US, whereby these huge, vast metropolitan areas, what was the point of doing all of this kind of, you could just let it go, right? Well, now we're changing the dynamic, and it becomes I want to write about it is, we can assume the supply and demand moves very quickly, but you almost need a sort of cultural shift. So, for example, developers will build more places for single people, right? Seems an easy thing to do, but when you speak to developers, they say, well, we had to get changes in the coding. We had to get, because they had no codes for single-person accommodation with retail at the bottom or retail on the first floor. You actually have to get the codes changed, the building codes changed. You have to get the planning things changed. That takes a while. You almost have to kind of get a kind of shift of a whole kind of, paradigm's the wrong word, almost a whole kind of mode of operation. So it's not just, the economy is supposed to get supply and demand, so it takes a while for these, but once it does happen, then it really kind of takes a while to get going. It's like, I remember the economist argument about making changes to macroeconomic policy. It's like pulling a brick off with an elastic band. It takes a while and then suddenly it bits you right in the head. And so that's what's happening in cities now. In the sense now the more developers have the codes, they have the planning regulations are changed, there's a demand, there's supply, they have an experience, the engineers now have an experience of building for single person households, which is not, for 50 years they kept building single family dwellings in the suburbs. They got the hang of that. It was very difficult for American builders to go back to actually reinvent it. But once they do, they're like everywhere, and they're on a roll now. So this is like 3 blocks from where I live, and this was, so you can see all of this. This was just kind of empty. This wasn't even, we didn't have to kick out poor people. There's no people here, right? And this was, so this last formation, it was a US intelligence service building. So no one knew exactly what. Probably tortured people in there. So the revalorization of space is, in a sense, we have a lot of stuff on gentrification, and the classic gentrification becomes like, it's almost like, well, you have to start off with the Neil Smith thing. You have to start off as like, there has to be poor people and they have to be moved out. That's the whole and so people that then start to say, how close is the gentrification? Well, if you define gentrification like that, can we just move away from that? I think it's only one element. So one element is new build. That there was no one there before. And so often a lot of the urban restructuring in urban studies, like the gentrification argument from 30 years ago, just squats there. And people say, well, there's a urban rent gap. Who the hell can you measure? That's an existential, that's like how many angels in the pin. How could you ever find that urban rent gap? It's just crap. Like, let's not do that anymore, right? Let's just start off with the sense of like, we don't have to kind of start off from the same position. There's an urban rent gap, there's poor people, and there's rich people bumped them out. Sometimes that does occur. There is no doubt about that. But actually, what's often happening in these spaces is new build on brownfield sites, where there was no people before. And if all of our stuff goes through this prism of classic gentrification, it just becomes tedious. I mean, I want to be your own belief, for me anyway. And it's like, can we move on from that? And so let's look at the thing, what's driving new build, for example. So I say this about urban studies. Actually, I think more interesting stuff is coming from economics. But urban studies is dominated by about three theories. And one of them is gentrification, the classic gentrification. And everything's explained by it. Is it close to that? Is it that?
Well, these geographers.
I blame them. I'm blaming Neil because he's dead now. It's always easy to do. But yeah, so the notion is like, you could just get rid of it. It's only one element in this urban restructuring that's going on, right? It's not the main one. In some cities it maybe is, it's just one variant. You're getting a new build going on brownfield sites, on greenfield sites, greenfield inside the city, and there's a rehab of existing spaces, right? And connected to kind of architects. So the classic gentrification argument never mentioned anything about the shift from modernism to postmodernism, or the emphasis of the new towards the authentic, right? So it's just time for us to move on. 25 years of the rent gap is way too long. And the importance of the millennials, I think, should not be overstated. It tends to be a youth kind of cohort. And so there's a lot of work done in the millennials, which is, when were they born again, the millennials? Anyone remember? I think they have to be born after 1990, I think. No, I think it's 19, it's various things, but generally it's so we'll say 1980s, because we're not exactly sure, so we're just going to say 80s. And I can tell. And so one of the things that they important when they do these studies of millennials in the US, unlike their parents' generation, they're less dependent on cars. They've actually managed to wean themselves. If you ask older Americans, they identified themselves. A whole culture of cars was built up. And now, millennials, zip cars, Uber, increasingly there's less young people have cars in America, right? And they're used to it. And again, you need this change in regulation. So for example, you need things like Uber or taxis or zip cars. But then once they start, they become like this whole new urban form of living, right? So it's a change in urban forms of living. Millennials like the central city because they're larger and better marriage and dating pools, right? Millennials are in that age group when they're looking to hook up and get married, or not get married, or just hook up, right? I mean, or it's more single person. So obviously the marriage thing is a slightly more Presbyterian thing, I have now, obviously. It's more just kind of hooking up. And so your chances of hooking up are much better, quite literally. And that's actually a major driving force. And we've always been a bit kind of queasy about sex, I think, in urban studies. And there are a guy called Phil Hubbard does a lot of work on sex. But we have a lot of work on the urban erotics in a sense. The other thing is we all know that the millennials, I know this from the surveys, is they have a higher valuation of time, importance of walkability, and convenience, way more than their parents did. Now, what's cause and what's effect. But what drives them, in a sense, is, so for example, in Washington, D.C., where I live, housing markets are dominated by how close they are to the metro now for apartments. Now, that's probably always been the case in Hong Kong for years, right? So you guys are used to that. That's relatively new for the US cities. Probably there's a difference in age. I mean, in London, that was always the case. Of course, you were to the underground or whatever. In Paris, the metro. But this is relatively new for this suburban society of the US. And they have a higher valuation of urban services. And what I mean by that is restaurants, gyms, convivial public events is the term used, festivals, music, concerts.